Lisa, thank you so much for being here today.
Julia, I am so thrilled to be here and to see you in person.
I know, we talk all the time. I'd love to hear a little bit about your law practice. Tell me a little bit about you.
So a little bit about me. So before I was actually an attorney, I was in the fashion business. And then I went through my own divorce and decided to become a matrimonial attorney. My divorce was complex and had a lot of financial and custodial issues. And I really, frankly, enjoyed some of those issues, I have to say.
Was that a sign?
It was an absolute sign. It was interesting, and I really felt that I could be helpful to people. And I also noticed that my attorney was not quite as responsive as I wanted him to be, and decided that this is something that I could do and that I would be responsive to my clientele.
You're one of New York City's top divorce attorneys. What do you love about your job?
I love that there are new issues every single day, that you really, as a matrimonial attorney, you really have to think on your feet. I know so many practices of law, you're looking at case law, which we do, and you're looking at statutes, which we do, but so much of matrimonial law is a lot of common sense. Well, do you send your child to the therapist if your child needs therapy? Do you save and put monies into a joint account? Do you have your own account? Have you commingled your account? Is there a business to value? And what is that business? And you learn about all these different businesses that you wouldn't actually have exposure to. And you're learning about the intricacies of the businesses. So I just think it's interesting, and I think that it's very challenging.
And very dynamic.
It is very dynamic every day.
Before couples get married, what should they be thinking about?
They should be thinking about how they are going to save, spend, what their future looks like. Are they going to have children? Are they not going to have children? If they are having children, what is that going to look like in terms of, is there going to be a stay-at-home parent? Are they going to have a nanny? Is one parent going to stop working for a period of time? How does that get essentially dealt with if there is a divorce, if there is a death in the family? Are we providing for the child? Are we providing for ourselves? What do we do with our inheritances? What do we do with our separate property? What do we do with the debt that we might be coming into the marriage with, or the assets that we're coming into the marriage with? So, and what income is being generated by each of us, and how is it going to be treated? It's so many things to think about. And the most important piece of it is that you need to be discussing it.
Yeah. Sounds like they need a prenup.
It sounds like they definitely need a prenup.
If nothing else, a prenup is an opportunity to have all of the discussions. So what should couples be really focused on including in the prenup or not including?
So I think that I usually tell people that they should include in the prenup something about any assets that they're bringing into the marriage. So if they're bringing assets into the marriage, for example, it may be a second marriage. It could be that they've already inherited or generated wealth themselves. It could be a marriage later in life or earlier in life. But if they're bringing assets in, how are those assets going to be treated? Are they going to become marital property, meaning they're going to be shared? Or are they going to become separate property? And how are you going to make sure that you keep them separate? They should also be thinking about what happens in terms of a home that they may buy, and how they're going to treat that home, whether it's going to be something that they're going to put in joint names or in their own names, how they're going to pay for the down payment for capital improvements, etc. What's going to happen if somebody dies, if one of the spouses dies? That's something that so many people don't think about, Julia, and it's such an important piece. What happens to the assets? Is there life insurance? Is there going to be a provision that the separate property is going to go to the other spouse, or is only the marital property going to the spouse? Or are you waiving what we call in New York your right of election, your right to get that 1/3 of the estate if there's nothing in a will or nothing provided for? So there's so many things to think about when you're going into a prenup. Maintenance, alimony. As you know, we can't think about child support. We can't think about custody if there's no child born of the marriage. But
what if there is a child born?
Well, if there is a child born in the marriage, then you can contract for child support and custody. However, keep in mind that things change over time. And so if we're looking at this and the child is 1 when you're signing this, and the child is 10 when you're actually, unfortunately, going through perhaps a divorce or a dissolution of the marriage, it may be that agreement that you entered into isn't appropriate, and there may have been a substantial change in circumstances. And the courts will always look at best interests of a child.
What about inheritance? There's this common misconception among couples, almost no matter what state you're in, that inheritance is always separate and that it doesn't matter when it comes in and it doesn't matter where it is held in a joint bank account or a separate account, that it will always be deemed separate because it came from one party's family. What do you think about that?
Well, that's wrong. So that's what I think. It's wrong and it's dangerous. Yeah. So what I would say is this. Inheritances are separate if you have provided for them to be separate, and particularly if you provided for them to be separate in a prenup and identified them in some way. Now, you may get your inheritance later in the marriage. The key is your prenup and then making sure that you keep the inheritance separate. So what do I mean by that? Well, we have a glass of water here, right? Okay, let's just pretend that that glass of water is your inheritance. And now you go and you work for the day or work for the week and you pour your income into the glass of water. Here it is in the glass of water. It still looks like a glass of water. Now I pour some off. I'm not going to do that all over your table. But bottom line is I pour some off. I don't know whether I've poured off the inheritance or I've poured off the income. And so you have essentially commingled the income and your separate property. And by commingling it, you may in fact lose it. And that is really important. There are ways to deal with that in New York. Sometimes people make the argument that, well, since most of the glass is my inheritance and I only had a tiny bit of income come in and a tiny bit of income go out, then I should get most of it anyway. That argument may fly because we have equitable distribution in New York, but it may not fly. And so you want to keep your inheritance separate and apart.
And a lot of the final decision may just depend on the judge in equitable distribution states. Is that correct?
That's 100% correct. Yeah. There are certain factors that they look at, your age, your health, what other assets there are, lifestyle, all of these kinds of things, right? Whether there are children in the marriage who has to stay in the marital residence. But at the end of the day, a lot of it is at the discretion of the judge after hearing the evidence. And so it may be that a particular judge has a particular viewpoint of the matter, the people, whether there should be more of an even split or not. And so it could be that you didn't keep your inheritance separate and a judge finds that it is now marital and splits it right down the road. It's 50-50.
Yeah. Couples often think about a prenup as something that is more protective to an older man marrying a younger woman. That's no longer the case. How can women protect themselves in a prenup?
So by negotiating. So hiring great lawyers, negotiating hard, making sure that you do not feel like you're being pushed against the wall, making sure that you stand up for yourself, that you have a voice. I have negotiated so many prenups for women that come to me. And they have been given a deadline. They have been told, here's the prenup. It's 2 weeks before the wedding. You must sign it or I'm not marrying you. And they're in tears, literally in tears, and they're ready to sign it. And we look at these prenups and we say, don't sign them. Don't sign them.
Because they get upheld.
Because they get upheld, exactly. Yeah. Nobody is likely to set aside your prenup because you signed it because you weren't going to get married if you didn't sign it.
Right.
That's just not the law. And so you really need to negotiate it. Put the wedding off. Say, you know what? I'm okay if we put the wedding off. Or I'm okay if we don't sign the prenup and we sign a postnup. Or I'm just not doing that.
Yeah. Are there any specific provisions women should be thinking about?
They should think about spousal support for sure. They should think about equitable distribution. I would say spousal support is very important to think about. It's an opportunity, in my view, to negotiate a package for yourself. Yeah. So, for example, if you believe that you are going to stay at home with your children, raise your children, if you and your spouse-to-be have discussed that, and that is something that you both wish to have, well, why shouldn't you actually make sure that you are compensated in some way?
Yeah.
And the reason being is that after you've stayed home and out of the workplace for 10, 12, 15, 18 years, it's very difficult to go back and build yourself up that ladder. Yeah. Your spouse has been out there. He's been traveling. He's been doing all the things that people do to build up the trajectory of their careers. Yep. But you can never get those years back. And so negotiating a package of spousal support that compensates you in some way for those years that you're giving up, it's so important. And, you had mentioned just a few minutes ago, the older man, the younger woman. Well, that's not really what a prenup is about. A prenup is there so you actually can take control of your financial future.
Lisa, we just published a New York Law Journal article together about embryo clauses in prenups. Can you tell me a little bit about it?
Sure. So it was so exciting to do this with you, Julia, and very excited that we did it in the New York Law Journal.
So great.
And it's a great article. It's very edgy and an interesting topic. And I think it really, it's so important for couples who are going to or thinking about IVF because they don't really understand that some of the forms that they're signing at these clinics, hospitals, doctors' offices are actually binding in the event sometimes of a divorce or in the event of a separation. And although they're not focused on it, they have to start to think about what are they signing and have they actually consulted with an attorney when they're signing this? I'm going to tell you, after I wrote the article, I spoke to my daughter. Okay. And I said, by the way, have you ever seen a form like this? And she said, yeah, a lot of my friends have signed these forms. Well, don't they consult with attorneys? No, they don't consult with attorneys. Really? So I think that it's important to know that these forms are upheld in courts, that you may be deciding how the embryos are going to be stored, whether they're actually going to be destroyed at some point in the event of the breakup of a marriage or a relationship. You may not be able to utilize these embryos that you think that you now have. So it's so important that you look at this. And the other piece of the article that we wrote about, which, as you know, is that you can start to think about this when you're actually negotiating your prenuptial agreement too. And these are important clauses to have in your prenuptial agreement. So since we wrote the article, I will tell you that I raise this issue now all the time. and I probably had 3 or 4 conversations, and people are a little bit stunned by the questions. And they're taken back, and then they start to think about it, and they say, well, I might actually use IVF, and I might be in that situation, and what is it that you're saying? And you have to start to think about the fact that you need to take control of what is going to happen to these embryos out of utero.
Yeah. And it's an opportunity to have the conversation. I, too, Lisa, have so many friends who have been through the process. And they don't know what they signed. They don't know what was included in those forms. They don't know what embryo disposition means. And I think it's so common when you're in that high pressure situation, you just, sign on the dotted line and move on. You're more worried about all of the other things. And so I think it's really important for us to have a conversation about whether or not it's appropriate for a couple to include it in a prenup. And if nothing else, even if they don't move forward with the prenup, they had the conversation.
Exactly. And look, I'm going to say we got pretty edgy in our article because, as you know, in New York, unless a child is born of the marriage, right? Unless the child is actually born, you cannot contract for what's going to happen in terms of support or custody. Now you're contracting for embryos that are outside the utero, and you're actually contracting as to custody of those embryos.
I guess it depends what state you're in.
Well, it does, right? So in New York, you can contract for these embryos in terms of custody outside the utero. You can determine that someone is not going to actually be responsible, that they won't have to pay child support, that you can have the embryos, for example, and maybe your spouse or your spouse-to-be won't have to pay support. These are all important because they really distinguish a person. Okay, court says you cannot actually contract when the embryo is in utero until the child is born, but embryos outside the utero, you can contract.
It's fascinating.
And so it is fascinating. It's a very interesting point.
How do you feel about postnups?
So I love postnups. I think postnups are a way sometimes to amend the prenup. And it's important to consider them because sometimes things change.
Yeah.
And if you're both on board with the fact that things have changed, maybe you didn't think that you were going to stay home and have a child, and all of a sudden you've decided that you are going to. Maybe you now have a special needs child, and one of you really needs to stay home and be with that special needs child. Perhaps one of you came into an inheritance or something different happened that you didn't contemplate because it's hard to think so far ahead, although that's kind of what you're really being forced to do when you're looking at a prenup.
Yep.
So I think it's a way to keep the conversation going about finances and make sure that everything is equitable as you go down the line in terms of years of your marriage. And it's a great way for people to sit together and be transparent and continue their financial relationship, and which makes for a great marriage.
What about for couples who they didn't get the opportunity to get a prenup? Maybe they've hit a rough patch. Is a postnup appropriate?
So it depends, right? So I'm going to say that you have to be careful. You're in that rough patch. Is somebody asking you to sign a postnup because they're planning a divorce? Or is someone asking you to sign a postnup because they really want to enhance the marriage and take some of the pressure off in terms of maybe some financial considerations? It's a question that you have to ask yourself. You may not really know the answer, and so you have to trust your gut, speak to an attorney, make sure that you review this with an attorney. Don't get sandbagged. That's what I'm going to say. Don't get sandbagged.
In the instance where parties were clearly divorce planning, is a postnup enforceable?
Yes, they're enforceable. Look, I'm going to say, in New York, postnups are enforceable. Some states, actually, postnups are not enforceable. So you need to know what is happening in your own state. But in New York, postnups are enforceable.
How about for couples who created a prenup? They're happy with the terms, but again, circumstances have changed. Can they do a postnup once a year? Should they do it once every 5 years? Should they do it once every...
I think it's different for everybody. And remember, you're going to have to agree to do this postnup.
Yeah.
It's really important that you understand that. Once you sign that prenup, that's your contract. That could be your contract for your entire marriage. 30 years from now, you could be looking at this prenup. So negotiate carefully. Think about it carefully.
Yeah.
Don't give it away. I stress this because there's so many people who come and they want to be married so badly that they are willing to give away finances that are going to be so important for them later. And so be careful, because you might not be able to negotiate that postnup later.
Yeah.
Somebody may say no.
Do you see that mentality more with men or women?
The mentality of take it or leave it.
I want to get married so bad, I'm willing to sign whatever it is.
I see it more with women. It's unfortunate, but I do see it more with women. I think that men tend, it's not always, but they tend to be able to say, I am just not doing it. Now, that does not mean that I don't have a lot of strong women who come to me and say, I'm just not going to do it. And we have really had to get on sometimes on a phone call or a Zoom with everybody present.
Yeah.
And so that everybody can be clear, it's not happening. We're not signing the agreement, right? And it's interesting to see some of these people who have had hard no's, they come to the table at that last moment if they see that you're really not signing.
I've seen so many strong women. I mean, these are women in the C-suite. These are women who are super accomplished. And they just are like, I can't sign a prenup. It's not romantic. And it's hard. It's hard to explain that it's not about that. I mean, marriage is about a lot more than romance.
Marriage is definitely, look, in New York, we call it a financial partnership. Yeah. People don't want to hear that very often, but it is. Yeah. If you weren't creating this financial partnership, you can just be together.
Sure.
And in New York, you would have no rights, essentially, no rights to alimony, no rights to equitable distribution. You would just have your own financial lives. And by the way, many people create those separate financial lives even when they're married in their prenups, which we see more and more of. That's a trend we do see much more of. But I think that generally, the clients that come to us want to sign the prenups, or they're on board to sign the prenups. We don't see a lot of people who are coming to us and saying, well, I don't really want to sign one. Mm-hmm. Maybe they were shocked when they first heard about it. But I think that the trick of this whole thing is to start having that conversation early. Don't hand somebody a prenup, and I say this so many times, don't hand somebody a prenup 2 or 3 or 4 weeks before the wedding. It's so unfair. And it's going to wind up in a state of mistrust.
Yeah.
Because you're really pressuring that person, and it's not to the point of duress, and it's not to the point of coercion, and no, it's not going to be set aside, but it's a bad taste.
Yeah, right before the wedding.
Right before the wedding.
When should couples start talking about a prenup?
So I think that they should start talking about a prenup before they get engaged. I think that it should be kind of part of the conversation. I think that as you're really seriously dating someone, you can say, at some point, I've always thought about marriage, and I've always thought that I will have a prenup. And what do you think about a prenup? And do you know anybody who has a prenup? And start having the conversation. Or something like, my family has wealth, and I'm just going to tell you now, we have to sign a prenup if we really are going to get serious, so that somebody isn't shocked by it.
Blame the parents, blame the financial advisor.
Always
blame
the
lawyers.
advisor.
You and I are both on the board of Savvy Ladies, a wonderful nonprofit for helping women who are disadvantaged with financial literacy. Tell us a little bit about your involvement with Savvy Ladies.
So I got involved with Savvy Ladies. I was just looking. I think it was 2017. Wow. And I had met Stacey Francis, the founder, through, we had mutual clients. She is a financial advisor also, and she has a lot of matrimonial clients, people going through divorce, mostly women. And I, of course, have my matrimonial practice. And I was really struck by her genuineness, and just her wanting to help women. Yeah. And she had started this organization, Savvy Ladies, which she started in memory of her grandmother. Her grandmother had been financially abused and physically abused, because I always say financial abuse is a gateway to physical abuse and emotional abuse. And even though there was sufficient, I think, funds, as I understood it, she had no control of those funds. Yeah. And as a result, she was literally pushed to her death. And so Stacey started the organization, and when I came on, it was a sleepy organization at the beginning, but it has it has grown tremendously, as you know, Julia. Yeah. And our board is made of really phenomenal women, and we serve over 3,000 women a year now through our helpline, which we actually had NASDAQ helped build an app for us. Salesforce helped us gather data. KPMG helped us gather data. We have a deck now of data that actually we have analyzed, and we have, with KPMG's help, put together, which shows who we are serving by diversity and geography and marital status. And we have learned that women who are coming to Savvy Ladies are really interested in family finances, building a small business. If they are single women, a lot of them are interested in building a small business, budgeting, and other financial issues. And after they work with our volunteers, we have over 300 volunteers. And after they work with our volunteers, the self-reported data shows that they feel less anxious. Some of them feel that their confidence really soars. Yeah. And as a result of that, we are able to figure out how to move forward in terms of more programming for women and really helping women answer their financial questions. Yep. The secret sauce is the helpline. Yep. It is a place where we actually match women one-to-one to financial advisors to answer their financial questions. And they call in or go through the app, they put their financial question on, volunteer pulls it off, and they are off and running.
I think it's so incredible, and I've really enjoyed working with Savvy Ladies. One of the most recent things that we worked on was the chat, and we're utilizing AI to help women access information that's on the site. And it's really meaningful to me, because I think it is incredibly important for women to take control of their financial lives. It's important for them to feel empowered with information. And society teaches women from a young age that, like, don't worry about that. The men will handle it. And I think the fact that Savvy Ladies is giving more and more women, especially from communities where maybe they did not have the opportunity to better understand their own finances and take control of their lives, is just, it's incredible.
It's amazing. And, you and I both know you were in family law, and we both know women come to us all the time. Yeah. They have no idea what their finances are. They have no idea how to figure out where their accounts are, where the investments are made, how they're made, what the actual income is. Sometimes they're just given a tax return and said, sit, and they're told just sign it.
Sign it.
They may not have the passwords. A lot of them are financially abused, and as a result, they are then emotionally abused and sometimes physically abused. Savvy Ladies is a place that people can go, women can go, and really get the help that they need.
I totally agree. And when we talk about women in divorce, I can't tell you how many really accomplished women I've seen while they're going through the divorce process, and they say, I just don't know what accounts we have. I'm embarrassed, but I actually have no idea where to look. And it's so common. Do you see that too?
I see it all the time. And I will say that it's so frustrating because it's so difficult, I think, for women to feel that they are entitled to know what is going on financially in their marriage. And many of them are, they are supporting their families by doing other things other than earning, right? And they have made decisions together as spouses to raise children, to support one of their spouses' careers. And they are really unable then to access money. They are sometimes put on, quote, an allowance. The worst is when they are actually earning the money and they are put on an allowance. And
that's financial abuse.
That's financial abuse, exactly. But we see it. We see they literally, their funds from their income are wired into an account that is controlled by their spouse, and then they are given an allowance. And they put up with this. And it's very disturbing. It really is.
That's wild. How do you think that HelloPrenup is increasing access for couples to get prenups?
I love HelloPrenup because it is really, I think, making that conversation happen in households about prenuptial agreements. I mean, we have seen just generally a huge uptick in people wanting to get prenups. And I honestly think that HelloPrenup is the reason. I think that people are starting to think about prenups. You have made it so much more accessible to people, and that makes it much more of a conversation. And young people, it's so accessible for young people to be able to go online and to fill out your forms and to utilize HelloPrenup in creating a prenuptial agreement for themselves. So I think that you really have opened the door wide open now for
with
people,
your help, Lisa.
Well, but for people to get these prenuptial agreements, to have these conversations, to be talking about their finances. You have done that.
It's so important. And 47% of millennials and Gen Zs who are engaged or married have a prenup, which is amazing because that number 10, 15 years ago was only 5% of all marriages. So I think prenups are increasing in popularity. But I also think what that tells us is the conversation around money is less stigmatized. And hopefully that means longer, happier marriages. So
I think that's true. So we should talk about drafting prenups and how important it is in terms of drafting them. Look, prenups are fabulous. Prenups are really important. But you need to make sure you're reading your prenuptial agreement. This is not a cookie cutter one for all. You need to think about your prenuptial agreement. What are you trying to accomplish? What's the goal? Speak about it with your spouse-to-be. Have the conversation. Speak about it with your attorneys. Make sure that the prenuptial agreement is clear to you, because if it's not clear to you, I promise you it won't be clear to a judge later. That's the key.
That's a great point.
It's got to have clarity. And it should cover certain things, right? So it should cover premarital assets. It should cover inheritances, income. What are you doing with your income? We always put in something about the marital home, because if there is a marital home and you both want to stay in it, well, who's going to have the first option to stay in that marital home? And so we literally outline it. Who's going to have the first option? Who's going to have the second option? Making sure that nobody has to move out of the marital home before there's a custody agreement in place. We think about that because we've had those cases where we've seen those prenups and everybody's supposed to move out. Well, what happened to those kids?
Right.
So what's going to happen in terms of the death of a spouse? How is that other spouse going to be provided for? Are they going to be able to stay in the home? Do you want to make sure that they're provided for going forward, whether there are children, whether they're not children, spousal support? These are all the things that should be covered. We cover very intricate issues such as restricted stock units. You may be coming into the marriage and you may have restricted stock units, for example, that are going to vest in the future. Are those going to be marital? You were granted them prior to getting married, but now they're going to vest during the marriage. How are they going to be treated? How are the future stock units that you're going to get being treated? Bonuses, how is that going to be treated? You might be getting married in December, right?
Yep.
And now your full year you've been worked for a full year. How is your bonus going to be treated? It's going to come in maybe in February or March. So during the marriage it comes in, but you earned it before the marriage. Yeah. All things that should be considered that you have to think about.
Speaking of financial disclosure, why is financial disclosure important in a prenup?
Well, so it's one of the things that the courts will look at to see if the prenuptial agreement is valid. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have financial disclosure, I think that is I'm not going to say it's an absolute set aside because it's not, but it's a component.
Yeah.
Were you all represented by attorneys? Was there financial disclosure? Is it fair? Is it a fair agreement? What was bargained for here?
Sure.
What was the time period? It's all factors that a court looks at.
Yeah, I mean, at HelloPrenup, we require full financial disclosure. It's a question that we often get, right? Do I really have to disclose all my assets? And I think the danger is that if you don't, you're opening the door for this argument that I wouldn't have signed this agreement had I known that you had X.
Without a doubt. I mean, we always have full financial disclosure. Yeah. And people sometimes a lot of people don't want to tell us if there are, or don't want to tell their spouses to be if there are certain trusts. Yeah. And we always tell them, you're better off putting it down. You need to put it down because your spouse needs to know.
What about with inheritance? If your parents are hesitant to tell you what your inheritance will look like?
Look, I think that if your parents are hesitant to tell you, which I can understand, I frankly don't want to tell my daughter what her inheritance is going to look like. I want to make sure that she works and that she's creating a life for herself. So I can understand that, but there should be clauses that refer to the inheritance, and it should be in the prenup that there's an inheritance. Look, it may not be a guaranteed inheritance. I may spend all the money during my lifetime, so there may not be an inheritance. So unless there is a trust formed and it is an irrevocable trust, then maybe you don't have to put that down specifically because you can't get the information. But you should certainly, it should be a provision in the agreement.
What about estate planning? Should couples be thinking about estate planning in conjunction with their prenup?
I think that they have to start to think about it. And you know that the exemption is going away in 2026. So I think you can give like $13 million now, without having to pay the taxes later. And for the people who are inheriting the money to pay the taxes. And so it's something to think about as you're actually doing this right now. It's, you should do a will. You should actually, if you're going to form a trust, now is the time to do it. And it's great to work with a attorney who has also maybe a trust and estates attorney as well.
HelloPrenup offers access to attorneys all over the country in 45 states. New York is obviously one of those states. How should an individual decide whether or not that is the right attorney for them?
So usually in our office, we have a consultation. We have an initial consultation. And I think that people make a decision during that initial consultation whether this is the person that they want to be working with. I think you want to have that discussion. It doesn't need to be in person. It can be a Zoom discussion. But you should see what the person, who this person is, right? What are their belief systems? What makes them tick? Do they have the energy level that you want? Do they have the are they aggressive or are they laid back? What is it that you're looking for in an attorney when you're actually going to be negotiating your prenuptial agreement? Do you think that they're going to have your back? That's really the question always when you're hiring an attorney. Do you think that they're going to have your back? And if you don't believe that, then go to the next attorney.
What do you think people should be looking for in a prenup lawyer?
I think that they should be looking for a balance. So the prenuptial attorney that you're going to hire should be listening to what you want out of a prenup, but they should be also offering guidance and advice. It shouldn't be a rubber stamp. So you should expect that there could be some pushback, that they may say, well, you might want to consider this, or you aren't thinking about this, or what happens if this occurs, as opposed to you just need somebody who's going to literally draft what you want. You need somebody who's going to give you some guidance, and the reason that they can give you that guidance is they've been in the courtroom. They've litigated the issues. They know probably what's going to happen. They've seen it 25 or 30 years from now when those people come back with prenups or don't come back with prenups or come back with prenups that was so one-sided. So you want to have somebody who has that experience and knowledge and is willing to have that conversation with you, that honest conversation.
Communication is everything in an attorney-client relationship. What is the craziest prenup story that you have, Lisa? You've seen it all.
So, I would say the craziest prenup story that I have seen was both parties signed a prenuptial agreement. No question about it. And what was interesting is the prenuptial agreement over and over and over again, in fact, highlighted and bolded, talked about the fact that the prenuptial agreement relied upon the financial statement. So when I go to the back of the prenup, there's no financial statement.
Oh, no.
At all. And I say to the person, well, where's the financial statement that you relied upon, supposedly? And person says, well, I don't know. I don't remember seeing one. It was put in my mailbox and I don't know. And they went back and forth. Turns out there was no financial statements actually exchanged.
Oh, no.
And the parties signed the prenuptial agreement. And we went through all the emails to make sure. And at the end of the day, it turned out to be a reason to set aside or try to set aside the prenuptial agreement and to negotiate actually something for our client, because the prenuptial agreement was really never completed.
It's a perfect example of why financial disclosure is so important.
And I'm going to say it's also a perfect example of why attorneys need to see that last signed copy, because many times you're down to the wire.
Yeah.
And the client says, well, I'll just go and sign it. And we say, no, we need to see it after you sign it before you actually say, I do. I want to see the signed copy.
You need a copy.
Exactly.
You have worked with a lot of celebrity and high net worth individuals. How do their prenups differ from the everyday person?
I think that their prenups are very complex sometimes. They have really thought of, and we try to think of, all of the different components that their finances actually encompass, right? So we talked earlier about restricted stock units, which actually are very common now and very important and could be worth many, many millions of dollars. And those are one of, they may have board seats, for example, where they get stock units. They may have businesses and it could be family businesses and family wealth that's involved. And you want to make sure how much discovery is going to end up here. And so there could be clauses about financial discovery or the lack thereof in terms of a divorce. So we really try to look at the individual, what that individual is going to want to protect, because it's all about protection, and we try to craft that agreement for that individual. And so they are more complex. Look, if you have two W-2 wage earners and they're likely to they're likely to remain as W-2 wage earners, and they make about the same amount of money, and they don't believe that they're going to have children, and they don't believe that they're going to be going through IVF, and it's going to be pretty simple, and they just want to divide everything 50-50 and follow a statute for maintenance and spousal support. It's pretty easy and straightforward. But if you have someone who has assets that are complex, you've got to really think about how you're going to protect those assets.
Do you think that everybody should have a prenup before they get married?
So I do. Okay, I actually do. I believe that everybody should have a prenup, because I think that, first of all, it starts the conversation going. It's a great conversation for people to have about their finances. And I think that it helps people understand what the expectations are in the marriage. If they learn that they're going to remain home as a stay-at-home parent and they're not going to be supported, then it's a choice that they're making, right? And they are making a choice to either negotiate for spousal support or not negotiate for spousal support. If they believe that their inheritance is going to be treated as marital property, they have to make a decision. And their families may need to make a decision. So I think these are really important conversations to be having, and I do think everybody should have a prenuptial agreement.
Let's go back to postnups for a minute. What makes a valid postnup in New York?
Basically the same thing that a prenup, except you need consideration. So you need to actually have consideration, meaning there's an exchange of one thing for another. In a prenup, that consideration is your mutual love for each other and the fact that you're getting married. In a postnup, you actually need to be looking at what is the consideration, what is the exchange of assets, what is the exchange of support, etc. So that's the difference.
So if you were modifying a New York prenup into a New York postnup, there would need to be some additional consideration.
That's correct.
Can you give us an example of something?
Sure. So you may have a business and a marital residence and certain investment accounts. You're not going to have likely an agreement that gives everything to one person. You're going to instead have an agreement that might say the marital residence is X, and in exchange for the marital residence, the person is getting the investment account in Morgan Stanley or Chase or whatever.
You've hit it all, Lisa. Is there anything else that you think couples should know before getting married?
So I think that it's interesting. It's a great question. What else should they know?
Besides everything?
Besides everything. I think that it's important for couples to know what each one's goals are. What are they looking to do long term, right? And they may change. They may change those goals. But what's important to them? Is it important to them to have a big savings account? Is it important to them that they travel the world? Is it important that they have a home and that they are raising children? Or is it important to them to have the experiences of life? I think that these are good conversations to have because you really do need to be on the same page. Look, I look at my husband and myself, and we're very similar, right? We have very similar goals. And as you know, Julia, we're very different ages, right? We have 26 years difference between us. But yet, when we wake up in the morning, we have the same goals. Yeah. So I think it's really important to have these conversations and to know what each other's goals actually are in life.
I think you and Lloyd are a perfect example of a couple who knows how to communicate. I mean, when you two are together, it's just you could finish each other's sentences. You know how to joke with each other. What advice would you have, relationship advice, would you have for a couple getting married?
So I do think it's all about communication, right? And I do think that when I got married to Lloyd, I knew him. I really knew him. Now, I'll share that we knew each other many, many years back, right? So this was our second time around, essentially. But I think that we both knew what was important to each other, and we both also knew that we would be there for each other no matter what, and that nobody else came before each other. And I think that that's the key to a relationship, to a really strong relationship. Nobody is more important to me than he is, and nobody is more important for him than I am, and I know that. Yeah. So I think that that's a fundamental reason that people make their marriages work, right? There's no question about it.
That's amazing advice. I love that. Thank you so much, Lisa, for being here today. This was so much fun.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Julia. It was really fun to see you and to be with you.